It's no secret that the Grand Theft Auto Trilogy launch has been a disaster, with GTA Trilogy earning scathing reviews and being heavily criticized online. Shortly after launch, it was confirmed that developer Grove Street Games would be working to address concerns players have with Grand Theft Auto Trilogy, and now publisher Rockstar Games has issued a statement apologizing to fans and bringing back the original games. In a new statement, Rockstar Games has said that it sincerely apologizes to anyone who has had issues with GTA Trilogy, admitting that the collection did not launch in a state that meets Rockstar's standards of quality. Rockstar has updates planned that will address the various problems with GTA Trilogy, with the hope that the collection will eventually live up to Rockstar's standards. Even they apologize, Rockstar clearly didn't do any justice to those masterpieces. Even if they are not the developers of the remasters, Rockstar should have kept tabs on the development process, so they could present it in a respectable way. They should have kept tabs on them, so that they could deliver a pristine product. It is a big disrespect to the games and GTA fans who played a major part in gaming and Rockstar's stature, who is a big entity in the gaming medium. Of course, Grove Street Games done some improved lighting and effects, but the animations and character models are way worse than the original. Rockstar fixing GTA Trilogy, but it's also going to be bringing back the original games through the Rockstar Games launcher on PC. The original PC versions of GTA 3, GTA Vice City, and GTA San Andreas are all coming back to PC, and anyone that owns GTA Trilogy will get them all for free. Anyone interested has until June 30, 2022 to claim the free games, though Rockstar has not provided a specific date that they will be available. Grand Theft Auto, the Trilogy, the definitive edition, released in a poor state, resulting in overwhelming backlash against the game. Rockstar Games is now working to improve Grand Theft Auto the Trilogy, the definitive edition, with updates to address fan feedback and fix the various problems with the collection, having just dropped update 1.03. The 1.03 update for GTA Trilogy is easily the most significant update for the collection since launch, making well over 100 different changes across GTA 3, GTA Vice City, and GTA San Andreas. Rockstar released a list of GTA Trilogy Update 1.03 patch notes so fans can see every single thing that's been changed, but there are some fixes that are especially noteworthy. While the Grand Theft Auto Trilogy 1.03 update fixes some of the collection's many glitches and performance issues, it also addresses some other big fan complaints. For example, there were many upset when they discovered that the definitive editions of Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City used the San Andreas sound effects for their menus. In fact, it didn't take long at all for a GTA Trilogy mod to come out that restored the GTA 3 and Vice City menu sounds, but now fans don't have to download a mod to fix the issue. Rockstar Games has restored the original menu sound effects to GTA 3 and Vice City with the 1.03 update. Rockstar has also addressed the various misspellings and errors that can be found throughout the entire GTA Trilogy. It fixed the janky Rockstar Games logo in the Vice City pool, and also corrected errors on various signs and storefronts in the games. Some of these seemed like pretty egregious oversights, so GTA Trilogy fans will no doubt be happy to see the problems fixed. They may not have had a direct impact on gameplay, but they could still be distracting. Something that did have an impact on gameplay that's now been fixed are the GTA Trilogy rain effects. The GTA Trilogy rain effects were notoriously overbearing at launch, making it virtually impossible for players to see what they were doing in some instances. The GTA Trilogy 1.03 update goes a long way in fixing the rain effects, toning them down significantly. Speaking of weather effects, the new GTA Trilogy update gives players the option to add ground haze to San Andreas Definitive Edition. The lack of fog in San Andreas made it so the game had an increased draw distance, which on paper may sound like a good idea, but in practice, it had some unfortunate consequences. Many fans felt as though the lack of fog made the San Andreas map look much smaller, and it also in general made the game look worse. Rockstar Games releases Update 1.04 for GTA the Definitive Edition, fixing more of the lingering issues from launch. Grand Theft Auto Trilogy players quickly noticed collision issues when the game was released, but Rockstar Games has largely fixed this issue. Camera-related problems, which were illustrated by a clip of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas protagonist CJ riding a bicycle, have also been addressed with the new GTA Trilogy update. Although Rockstar Games has noted that misplaced objects have also been addressed with Update 1.04, it's currently unclear if all misplaced objects have been properly placed in the remastered GTA Trilogy, or if only a portion of the problem was resolved. Additionally, incorrect and misplaced textures have been fixed with Update 1.04, suggesting that the majority of the textural problems in Grand Theft Auto Trilogy, the definitive edition, have been resolved. Similar to visual textures that Update 1.04 fixed that didn't translate well in the remastered Trilogy, many of the displayed subtitles were incorrect prior to the recent update, but these issues have been resolved. In addition to the subtitle text that had issues in GTA Trilogy, the definitive edition, the displayed help text also had issues from the launch that have been adjusted appropriately to give GTA fans tips during loading. When GTA the definitive edition was released, a significant number of problematic textures showed the project's poor modernization. Included among the textures that didn't translate well in the definitive edition was an improperly recreated Rockstar Games logo in GTA Vice City. Many businesses and other popular locations in Liberty City, San Andreas, and Vice City also featured inaccurate textures compared to the original GTA Trilogy, were just recently fixed with Update 1.04. Grove Street Games is working to address all of the GTA community's concerns with Grand Theft Auto Trilogy, the definitive edition, and the prominent issues in the GTA Trilogy, such as visibility, while it's raining in GTA San Andreas, notable lack of fog. While the Update 1.04 patch notes may seem thin, countless individual problems with the remastered Trilogy have been fixed with the update. There are still some changes necessary to bring Grand Theft Auto Trilogy to where Rockstar Games would want it to be, but this update is clearly a massive step forward, and hopefully a sign of what's to come. The first three games that are part of Grand Theft Auto's 3D universe, Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, and San Andreas, are arguably Rockstar Games' most famous, historically important, and beloved works. This Grand Theft Auto Trilogy is credited for making the studio one of gaming's most prosperous and normalizing the use of licensed songs in the soundtrack. Additionally, it pushed the boundaries of what games could do thanks to the sandbox approach they took with their level design and the controversy they attracted. For a long time, Rockstar treated this trilogy of games better than any of its other games. Indeed, ports of this Grand Theft Auto Trilogy on newer consoles and mobile devices became the norm. However, upon announcing the existence of Grand Theft Auto the Trilogy the Definitive Edition, Rockstar also confirmed that the original versions of the games will soon be unavailable. Alongside Grand Theft Auto, the Trilogy the Definitive Edition's pitiful reception, this decision on Rockstar's part fueled the wrath of fans in the community. Rockstar has already attempted to make up for its mistakes. However, the removal of the original versions of the Grand Theft Auto Trilogy remains a problematic decision to begin with. If Rockstar really wants to show remorse for its provocative choices, then bringing the games back on platforms such as the PlayStation Store is the least it could do. In the past decade, the methods of producing and distributing video games have evolved. Digital purchases have become more common. Originally, this practice, due to platforms like Steam, was mostly dominant in PC gaming, making physical copies of computer games redundant in the process. As for consoles, digital-only games and games that are simultaneously available in physical and digital forms became the norm around the time the Wii, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360 entered the scene. Theoretically, digital gaming is immensely beneficial. It manages to save time that would be spent going to a store to buy a game in addition to leaving space on shelves for other things. However, there are some rather unfortunate drawbacks. For one, even with the usual updates modern games have, digital copies take up far more space than their physical counterparts. Having games be strictly digital can also be a problem, which is why giving digital-only games a physical release is important. Society is in a transitionary period, and physical releases of any media are still just as common as they were before the internet became ubiquitous. If a piece of media is only available digitally, then consumers have to rely on separate platforms to own a copy of said media. If something happens to the servers, or if the media is pulled from digital platforms, it can easily become a case of lost media. Some of the most infamous cases of games being lost media are Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and the PT demo. The latter is especially egregious due to the full game being abruptly cancelled. As a result, the only way to even play the PT demo requires finding a PS4 that has the game installed, which is far more tedious than finding a finished digital-only game that can no longer be purchased. As media preservation is being taken more seriously across all mediums. Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, and San Andreas are far from being obscure titles. Their impact on video games as a medium is almost immeasurable. Deep down, Rockstar is aware of the game's legacy, which is why Grand Theft Auto, the Trilogy, the definitive edition was made, to begin with. However, the existence of remakes and remasters does not render the originals obsolete. Sometimes, these remasters and remakes are upgrades in name only. The definitive edition's glitches and other technical issues make it a prime example of this phenomenon. The game's disastrous launch exposed the cynical side of remastering games. Rockstar removing the original games from Steam, the PlayStation Store, and other platforms just adds salt to the wound. However, in an attempt to make up for all the mistakes it made, Rockstar will release the original versions of the GTA Trilogy on its own store. This feels like a half-baked attempt to apologize, since it excludes a plethora of Grand Theft Auto players that can either not afford a functional gaming PC or played the games on the consoles they were originally made for and continue to do so with said console's successors out of habit. By excluding console players, Rockstar does not only lose potential revenue, but alienates players that might have been loyal fans for 2 decades now. Putting the original Grand Theft Auto Trilogy back on the PlayStation should be the bare minimum. If the entirety of the player base cannot experience these classic games properly like it was originally able, then Rockstar's reputation will continue to plummet. Speaking of different versions, a player recently found a debug command for GTA VR, while playing Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy the Definitive Edition. The uploaded video shows the player running around in first-person mode in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The video comes courtesy of @Videotech_ via Twitter. In it, the debug menu is implemented and first-person mode becomes active, allowing the player to wander around and even engage in a fistfight in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The mode, which is only available on PC, is in a very rough state as it doesn't work properly in several instances. Scrolling through the comments reveals that many think this may be part of the upcoming Grand Theft Auto San Andreas VR title from developer Video Games Deluxe. While a few speculated that this would be GTA 6 or even Red Dead Redemption 2 in VR, this latest find lends credibility to the theory that the upcoming title might actually be a VR version of one of the 3 titles in Grand Theft Auto The Trilogy the Definitive Edition. Though, considering how poorly the Definitive Edition has been received, Rockstar might be putting those plans on hold until this current fire is put out. To double down on a re-release of a past game when the current version is in such a mess would only do further harm to Rockstar's already suffering reputation. At this point, there are many calling for refunds and that the company stop remaking, remastering, and releasing old titles, and instead focus on support for Red Dead Online or Grand Theft Auto 6. No matter what Rockstar decides to do, one can be sure that this isn't the last players will hear of something being discovered in the Definitive Edition. The gaming community was understandably angry when the release of GTA The Trilogy Definitive Edition proved to be an absolute disaster, with bugs and poor quality of life upgrades that somehow made the remaster look worse than the originals. It's not too surprising that the GTA Trilogy has one of the worst Metacritic scores of all time, currently sitting at a user score of 0.5. While Rockstar is now moving quickly to fix a ton of issues with all 3 games, there are some who are perhaps waiting in the wing for the physical release on console, but it seems as though they will have to wait a bit longer. According to a recent tweet from Rockstar Games, the remaster of the classic Grand Theft Auto games is set to arrive on Xbox and PlayStation, as well as Switch, as physical copies. But the tweet states that the dates have been pushed back a little. The Xbox One, Xbox Series and PS4 versions will now be launching on December 17th, as opposed to the original date of December 7th, whereas the Switch port has now been pushed back to sometime in early 2022, though no concrete date has been given yet. Despite the gaming world's move towards a more digital business model, many players still prefer to have physical copies of games, and being told that they will have to wait a bit longer, especially for the Switch, will likely peeve many of them off a little. There's no official reason given as to why the boxed releases have been pushed back, but it may have something to do with the studio putting a lot of its efforts into patching the trilogy to make it less of a mess. Some have compared GTA Trilogy to the launch of Cyberpunk 2077, which was released a year ago, both of which were games that were clearly not ready for launch. At least it does appear that Rockstar Games is taking a lot of steps to improve the remaster, but for some, it may be too little too late. Speaking of disastrous launch, Cyberpunk 2077 is trending online as the game manages to, perhaps surprisingly, hit a major turning point in its redemption story. Cyberpunk 2077 is less than 2 weeks away from its one-year anniversary, and noticeably, it's trending online too. Many may recall how the game trended online at launch, where many shared bugs, game-breaking glitches, disappointing graphics, weak combat, and far more. Now, it's hard to say that RPG has emerged quite yet, but it seems Cyberpunk 2077 may be at a turning point in its redemption story. The past few days have been really warm, welcoming, and overall good for the game, which has received a ton of fixes over the past year. Indeed, Cyberpunk 2077 is currently trending on Twitter, but for all the reasons it didn't at launch. This week has been good for Cyberpunk 2077 for a number of reasons. Those who have waited to play it, perhaps after hearing about all of its launch issues, were able to pick it up incredibly cheap for Black Friday. Combine that with its Steam reviews having a very positive reception with this sale, and it's put Cyberpunk 2077 in the spotlight. CD Projekt Red has gone along with this upward momentum, discussing how the company thinks the game will be considered a great game in the long run. Furthermore, it revealed that the recent delay of Cyberpunk 2077's PS5 and Xbox Series X versions was due to the recommendations of the development team, something that has warmed many fans' hearts after it's understood that the devs were basically dismissed at launch. Yet, CD Projekt Red has said this will release in early 2022, as well as a big 1.5 patch for Cyberpunk 2077. It's hard to say Cyberpunk 2077 is fully redeemed. There are still plenty of glitches and bugs holding Cyberpunk 2077 back, but a lot of the worst has been squashed. That buried RPG is becoming clearer and clearer, if not completely unearthed. And that's a good thing. As aforementioned, Cyberpunk 2077 did not get its next-gen versions this year. A lot of content was pushed into 2022, but thanks to the work thus far and an influx of Black Friday shoppers, returning players, and more, Cyberpunk 2077 has gotten the most out of what could be considered very little at the end of this year. This is the momentum Cyberpunk 2077 needs going into 2022. If it can land its next-gen versions, if Cyberpunk 2077's first expansion launches and builds on the solid RPG that everyone thinks it can be, and if it can deliver where it has typically come short, Cyberpunk 2077 might very well be that RPG fans wanted. Not exactly the next-gen defining experience that some wanted it to be, but a solid RPG nonetheless. Once again, it's too early to tell if Cyberpunk 2077 will reach the full redemption story many want it to, but it has reached a turning point. Cyberpunk 2077 has nowhere to go but up, but it remains important that CD Projekt Red hits the high marks the company is known for. Who knows, Cyberpunk 2077 could be a completely different game by the end of 2022, and its terrible launch could be a valuable lesson learned. CD Projekt Red just held its Q3 financial report for the 2021 fiscal year, detailing how its resources have been used so far. In a series of horizontal bar graphs, CD Projekt Red visually outlines this year's development team allocation, starting with values from the end of 2020. At that time, over half of CD Projekt Red's resources went to the support of Cyberpunk 2077 and the development of its next-gen version, with about an eighth of its resources going towards the game's expansion. By the end of September, however, resources for Cyberpunk 2077's current support and its expansion have become about equal, with many resources of the former project transitioning to the latter. Besides Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt Red was managing resources for a variety of other projects as well. The studio's support of its Gwent-related projects has remained about the same since last year, with the official Gwent card game ongoing for a couple of years now. Seeing CD Projekt Red start moving its resources to new projects is an indication that Cyberpunk 2077 is headed in the right direction. Obviously, just using these visual representations is not truly determinative of how these projects are proceeding, especially since Cyberpunk 2077 support is still the largest category of resource allocation, but it is nonetheless a hopeful sign that CD Projekt Red will someday soon realize this game the way it intended originally. CD Projekt Red has narrowed down the release window for Cyberpunk 2077's next-generation console version, set to launch in the first quarter of 2022 on an unspecified date, shortly followed by the next-gen release of The Witcher 3 in the second quarter of 2022. In addition to releasing Cyberpunk 2077 for the next console generation, CD Projekt Red remains committed on providing the game with the polish it sorely needed at launch, as well as expanding on the development team working on it, with a promise of delivering a major Cyberpunk 2077 update in the near future. With no specific dates given for either the update or the expansion, the original plans for providing the game with rapid post-launch content support seem to have been put on hold or otherwise staggered by the work needed to smooth out Cyberpunk 2077's rough edges. Hopefully, the fanbase will get some of these oft-requested features in the upcoming update, as signs point that the developers still have plans for Night City, and will keep supporting the game for years after its launch. Aside from the bugs, CD Projekt Red also need to do some quality-of-life updates, from a third-person view option to customization to accessibilities. CD Projekt Red has yet to detail what players can expect from the expansion, but there are a number of improvements that it could introduce to the game. One of the possibilities that the developers should focus on, however, is customizable cars. As one might imagine, Cyberpunk 2077 players spend a lot of time driving around Night City. Whether it be during missions, driving to a store, or even just enjoying the scenery of the city, players become very familiar with their vehicles throughout their playthrough. The game features dozens of cars that are split up across 5 distinct classes. These include motorcycles, supercars, trucks, and even vans. Each one is uniquely modeled and controls differently with its own handling and speed attributes. While many players may want to chase down the car with the highest top speed in Cyberpunk 2077, others may instead go for one with better handling or health, giving players some variety. Players also have 2 distinct ways of getting the different vehicles to use. The first is to simply hijack any vehicle that they see, similar to what players are familiar with doing in Grand Theft Auto. Any car on the street can be hijacked and used by the player if they have a high enough body stat, but most of those cars cannot be kept in Cyberpunk 2077. Permanent cars that players can actually keep are either purchased or gained through missions. These cars are automatically stored for players and can then be summoned through their cell phones. However, once a player owns a car, there is nothing else that they can do with it. The cars can be purchased, but there are no options to even just change their color. With how much time players spend driving around Night City, it is disappointing for many players that they are unable to customize cars. Each car has a uniquely modeled interior that could add a lot of unique customization options for each vehicle, while also letting players really invest in their favorite vehicles. Doing so would take a lot of resources from the developers, but with CD Projekt Red ramping up development on Cyberpunk 2077's expansion, such a feature seems like it would be possible. Personalization is a massive part of the game's world, with people being able to modify their bodies at Cyberpunk 2077's Ripper docks and fit into their own distinct style. Players can also do this to some extent, and being able to take that even further to their vehicles would be a great way to reward players for putting the time into the game to customize their version of V. Being able to customize cars would also help players feel more connected to them, as they would see themselves in it whenever they would use it, rather than just the stock version that everyone gets when they buy it. There are a lot of examples that the developers could draw from when designing car customization in Cyberpunk 2077. Games like Gran Turismo, Grand Theft Auto 5 and Forza Horizon could provide a lot of ideas as far as the sheer variety of car liveries, mechanical components, and personalization that could be made available. However, it would also be wise for the developers to allow players to customize the interiors of their car as well, since Cyberpunk 2077 is a first-person RPG. The customization could also allow players to upgrade the components of their cars to improve their performance, or give them bonuses to actions like shooting while driving or more protection when being pursued by the cops. This would help make a player's vehicle choice play a bigger role in the game, while rewarding players who take the time to plan out what car they will most likely need for a mission. Cyberpunk 2077 could also add a location in Night City where players have to go to upgrade their cars. Upgrades would still have to be bought, but the owner of the garage could also include some new side quests in Cyberpunk 2077 that have to be completed to upgrade the shop and unlock more options. Hopefully, car customization is being considered for the game's future, especially with such an emphasis on vehicle traversal and exploration in-game. If CD Projekt Red can capitalize on this with a new Cyberpunk 2077 expansion in 2022, alongside any new updates along the way, the game could receive its expected renewal. However, that possibility will be heavily contingent on the reception of Cyberpunk's expansion. Moving forward, we have another somewhat disappointing launch, as Spider-Man is now available in Marvel's Avengers, and Crystal Dynamics releases a new trailer that details the With Great Power Hero event. Marvel's Avengers was one of the most highly anticipated games of 2020, however it launched to a relatively mixed reception from both fans and critics. It was praised for the main story, but the implementation of the games as a service model in Marvel's Avengers was a main source of criticism from fans. Since then, Crystal Dynamics has released a lot of new content for Marvel's Avengers, including full-story DLCs for Hawkeye, Kate Bishop, and an expansion centered around Black Panther. In addition, Spider-Man was announced as an exclusive character for PlayStation platforms in August 2020. It has taken more than a year to materialize, but Spider-Man is now available on the PS4 and PS5 versions of Marvel's Avengers, and Crystal Dynamics has released a new trailer accompanying its release. While the Spider-Man DLC does not have any proper story missions, his arrival does kick off a new hero event. Appropriately titled With Great Power, players can use Spider-Man without having completed the original story campaign or any post-launch DLC operations. The trailer mentions that the hero event revolves around Spider-Man stopping AIM from getting access to powerful technology. Peter Parker is in his early 20s, and he is initially recruited by AIM as an intern. He soon realizes that AIM is mistreating Inhumans, and seeks the Avengers' help in dealing with this threat. As a part of this DLC, players will also be able to tackle new challenges and harm training missions in order to earn unique rewards for Spider-Man. Around 40 suits have been confirmed for Spider-Man that can be earned through gameplay or purchased via the in-game store. Crystal Dynamics continues to add content to the game, and the latest update released on November 30th seems to have made a lot of improvements. It also adds the discordant sound raid to Marvel's Avengers, that sees the Avengers facing off against Claw. Last month, Square Enix had commented on the state of Marvel's Avengers, confirming that it was a disappointment. The publisher claimed that Crystal Dynamics' talents were not properly utilized, and stated that the developer was not the right fit for a games-as-a-service style Avengers title. This Spider-Man edition has many issues and disappointing things. First of all, the gameplay is stiff as hell, as Spidey stops for a second when shooting webs while swinging. The animations from the combat and traversal looks okay, but Insomniac has set the bar so high that this Spider-Man looks lame when compared. The fact that the expansion doesn't come with a story is heavily disappointing for me. I think PlayStation's partnership with Crystal Dynamics is not well defined, and to put this as a whole, this expansion is unnecessary. Cancelled video games are a common thing in the gaming industry, whether they happen behind closed doors or through a public announcement for a game that was previously shown off. One of the biggest and most tragic cancellations was Scalebound, a game from the hit action game studio Platinum Games. Despite an impressive showing of Scalebound back in 2014, Platinum Games formally announced its cancellation in 2017, the year it was supposed to release. It was a promising title, but was not able to get off the ground due to a number of circumstances, for which the director of the game, Hideki Kamiya, apologized for. Many people had high expectations for Scalebound considering Hideki Kamiya's track record. He was the pioneer of some of the most influential action games, being the director of games like Bayonetta and Devil May Cry. He is also one of the most outspoken directors in the gaming industry, not afraid to open up his opinions to fans about the gaming industry, including the struggles that he and his team faced when working with Scalebound. Kamiya was interviewed by YouTube channel Cutscenes in a series of documentary-style videos that detailed his career. The latest video covers some of the more recent games he directed, such as The Wonderful 101 and of course Scalebound. He mentioned that Microsoft did have high expectations for the studio, especially since they were releasing it for the latest Xbox console at the time. To meet these desires, Kamiya wanted to make a high-end photorealistic game. The other big push he wanted to make was for the world to match the graphics, citing other fantasy games that helped form Scalebound and its dragon-based gameplay. There, however, were a number of problems that he and the team at Platinum Games ran into during development. He noted there were so many elements that they weren't used to and lacked knowledge on how to develop for. Things of note included the Unreal Engine, along with building the game based on an online environment. In a very somber note, Kamiya acknowledged that Platinum Games just wasn't experienced enough, leading to Scalebound's cancellation. He apologized not only to the players that were looking forward to the game, but Microsoft as well, saying that he felt like he broke the company's trust as a business partner. While Scalebound currently doesn't have much of a chance of comeback, it's still an important, yet sad part of Kamiya's career despite the troubles it went through. Speaking of Xbox, Microsoft publishes its letter from when it tried to acquire Nintendo in the early 2000s, which players can view within the celebratory Xbox Museum. It's no longer a secret that Xbox attempted to acquire Nintendo back at the turn of the century, though many have wondered what the exchanges between the two companies were like. Thanks to the virtual Xbox Museum, players can now view, partially, one of the original letters sent between Microsoft and Nintendo. It's been known for some time that Xbox attempted to purchase Nintendo back in the early days of the brand's development. Kevin Backus, one of the original developers on the Xbox, recalled their meeting with Nintendo, which wasn't very pleasant, as Nintendo just laughed their asses off. The following year, Microsoft would return with another proposal for Nintendo, allow the Xbox team to develop the hardware, while Nintendo focuses on the software. As history has shown, Nintendo would go on to deny this offer as well, leading to the formation and legacy of the Xbox scene today. Those who visit the Xbox Museum can partially read one of the letters sent by Xbox in its attempts to buy Nintendo. The letter was written in the fall of 1999 by Rick Thompson, the then vice president of hardware at Xbox, and addressed to Jacqueline Story, the former executive vice president of business affairs at Nintendo. Thompson writes, "Dear Jacqueline, I appreciate you taking the time to try to arrange a meeting with Mr. Takeda and Mr. Yamauchi to discuss a possible strategic partnership between Nintendo and Microsoft on future video game platforms." Jinyo Takeda was the former general manager of Nintendo's integrated research and development team, while Hiroshi Yamauchi was the then president of Nintendo. Despite a large portion of the letter's body being covered by other text, some phrases are still readable, reflecting more of the history of these storied companies. This letter predates the revealing of the first official Xbox prototype, with the end of one of Thompson's sentences, stating, "To continue the development of our Xbox project." Thompson continues shortly after, likely offering Microsoft's support for Nintendo in making Dolphin the best video game console of that time. Famously, Project Dolphin was the code name for the GameCube during its development at Nintendo. A partnership between Nintendo and Xbox at the turn of the century would have certainly changed the video game landscape. Though Microsoft and Xbox did not have much to show for themselves, it is quite admirable of the companies to try and collaborate with Nintendo. While the partnership doesn't come close to what these discussions suggested, the modern relationship between Nintendo and Xbox is pretty special. Xbox getting the titular Banjo and Kazooie, and Steve from Minecraft into Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is surely evidence of that. Overall, I'm happy that the incident didn't happen. And that's all for the video, guys. Like and share the video for a greater audience. Comment your thoughts on the topics, and donations are always appreciated. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon, and until then, from SMPV, it's goodbye.
I found it, Aloy. Huh? What'd you send me?